Welcome everyone. Oh, good. Welcome everyone to the Introduction to Restorative Justice for the Maine Victim Assistance Academy. I'm Kelly O'Connor. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Training Institute Director at the Maine Coalition to End Domestic Violence. I'm really delighted to be co-presenting this material with Cara Cookson. A little bit about me for those who don't remember. Like I said, I work at MCEDV, but I previously worked at New Hope Midcoast, the Domestic Violence Resource Center that supports the Midcoast area in Maine, Knox, Lincoln, Waldo, and Saginaw counties. And I've been in my current role at the coalition for almost 3 years. But before I worked in sort of power-based violence and domestic violence work in the state of Maine, I did a lot of work overseas addressing gender and sexual-based violence and armed conflict, and looking at sort of this anti-violence work, which is really a human rights issue through the lens of human rights. And so that's sort of the approach that I take to this content that we're going to be presenting today.
And I'm Cara Cookson. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the VWA coordinator with the Office of the Attorney General. And I've also been on the faculty of the Restorative Justice Master's Program at Vermont Law and Graduate School for the past, I think, 4 or 5 years now. So I teach courses that are focused on victim services and trauma within the context of restorative justice. And I'm also trained as a victim offender dialogue facilitator. So that's my perspective that I bring to thinking about restorative justice content. We're going to cover the very basics today of restorative justice. This is meant to be completely foundational. So our goal is to help you understand what restorative justice is and why people do it, why people are excited about it, to understand basic concepts and terminology, and then to think about how you can be an effective advocate for victim survivors that you're working with. What are the hallmarks of safe, effective, and accountable programs, and where are the inroads where you can help advocate to make sure that the person you're working with is making an informed choice to participate and they're getting what they need from the process.
Thanks, Cara. So we're going to sort of set the stage here with an example of some harm that's done. And I think one of the hopes when we think about this example is we sort of think about, like, what does it mean to still be in community with people, right, who have committed some kind of harm, whether that's in a broader community or in a family unit, which is what we're going to look at here. But that's sort of the ethos, I think, for the RJ sort of model and consideration. Sort of what does it mean to be in community still with people who are causing harm? So imagine this is the circumstance. Think back to when you're 9 years old. You go into your sibling's room and maybe you stole their favorite toy. You brought it to school and you took it out on the playground and you showed your friends. And in the process, you broke the toy. You didn't mean to, but you still did. And you have to bring home the broken toy and it's in pieces. What should happen next? What does that look like? The answer to that question is going to look really different depending on the household. Do you admit what you did? Do you involve a parent? What's your relationship like with your sibling? Maybe there's some kind of punishment involved, maybe grounding or losing privileges. The toy should be returned, maybe exchanged to get a new one. Maybe there's an opportunity to fix it or, again, to pay for a brand new toy to replace the one that was broken. Most folks would certainly say that there needs to be some kind of apology, if nothing else, acknowledging that the harm was done, that it was wrong, and that it won't happen again. And probably at some point, that older sibling should be involved in the process. Ultimately, right, in this case, in this example, you and that sibling will still have to sort of live in the same house together, still maintain some type of sibling relationship. And that's what I was getting at when I was describing sort of what does it mean to still be in community with people who cause harm in our communities.
So one of the foundational principles of restorative justice is this idea that harm is relational, that when someone harms another person, it's a violation of some sort of relationship between those people. And we use that word relationship. We often are talking about intimate relationships or family relationships, but RJ is sort of starting from the idea that we're all connected, that all people are connected, that we exist in the same spaces, and that we all share some level of relationship. And so when we cause harm, it's harming not just the person as an individual, but the relationship and ultimately the community as a whole. And so I put up a quote here from Howard Zare, because if you talk about RJ, he's going to come up. He's often cited as the person who made RJ popular in North America starting about 30 years ago. But to be very clear, Howard Zare did not invent restorative justice, because this idea that harm is relational and that justice should be focused on repairing harm and repairing relationships and have the community involved in some way, it's just not a new idea. It did not originate in mainstream American culture. Cultures all over the world have based their justice systems and the process that they use for resolving disputes on these concepts for thousands of years. It's been around for a really long time. It's just more recently that it's been sort of appropriated and repackaged in North America. And currently in restorative justice circles, there's been this conversation about, well, where does restorative justice really come from? And the answer is it's been around for much longer than Howard Zare has been around. And for many of us, it might be a new idea, especially this word restorative justice. But in some ways, it's not a new idea. Yes, as Americans, I think we tend to be focused on our own individual selves and our nuclear family. And so the idea that harm is relational can feel a little bit uncomfortable, maybe, because you're like, oh, I'm not in community with that person who is causing that harm. But in Maine, I think it's actually easier for us to appreciate this idea because we all know what it's like to live in a small community. We see our neighbors at the store, on the street, and everyone's always saying, like, everyone's related to everyone around here. Because sometimes you literally are, right? And so those connections that we share and those inner relationships with other people end up being more obvious to us. And so then this idea of harm being relational starts to make a little bit more sense. Pass it over. Oh, actually, I need to keep talking about RJ principles.
No worries.
So I thought it was Kelly's turn. So we're going to talk about RJ principles for a minute. So and by the way, like, folks in the RJ world might differ on some of this. I think one of the hallmarks of restorative justice, and I sort of laugh about this, is that it can be hard to pin down because it really is community-based, and it's meant to sort of reflect the community and locality where it's happening, which can be difficult. But generally speaking, I think these are some restorative justice principles that most folks would agree on. So RJ is going to be focused on the harm that happened, not so much on what we are calling the crime that was committed if we're in the criminal context, or what the elements of the crime were. So, if there was criminal conduct or not, and somebody died, like, we're focusing on the harm that somebody died, and that someone may have done some things that contributed to that person dying, right? And it doesn't matter whether the crime is labeled first-degree murder or involuntary manslaughter, right? So we're more focused on the harm than on the crime or the elements of the crime. RJ is going to be focused on those who are impacted and making sure that they have an opportunity to address the harm directly, versus, let's say, in the criminal process, where we all know the state is the plaintiff party, the lead party in the case, and it's victims and survivors have a place in that process, but it's more incidental. The state is really the focus in the criminal process. RJ is going to involve everyone who has a stake in the outcome, everyone who may have been harmed, versus in a criminal process, we know that there's a statute and there are certain people who are and aren't considered the quote unquote victim in the case, right? RJ is going to be focused on repairing the harm that was caused and also identifying some of the root causes that led to the harm and trying to address those things versus pure punishment for the sake of punishment. That's not to say that people who are held accountable through an RJ practice aren't going to have to do some difficult things. Sometimes the outcomes in an RJ process can be much more stringent and rigorous than what might come out of the criminal process, but there's no sort of punishment for the sake of it. It's really what the things that the person who's responsible is doing in order to be accountable are things that are directly related to repairing harm. It needs to be voluntary for everyone. We think this is just a fundamental principle. No one should be forced to do it. It has to be consensual. So we're voluntarily doing it. We're doing it with informed consent. This is going to sound familiar for those who think about prevention work. It needs to be safe, right? One of the primary harms that can be caused by crime is people feeling like they're not safe. And so in order to repair that harm, an RJ process has to help to instill safety. Can't guarantee safety. We can never guarantee safety 100%, but it's going to be set up in a way to help people to feel as safe as they possibly can. It needs to be ethical. And we'll touch on some of the ethics pieces as we move forward. It needs to be transparent. Everybody needs to know what's going on. The facilitator shouldn't be hiding things from certain people. And there should be accountability. So the person who's responsible for the harm is taking responsibility. Now, contrary to popular belief, RJ does not require forgiveness, and it shouldn't ever require forgiveness. It shouldn't require apologies. It shouldn't require that everybody reconciles. There doesn't have to be like a big group hug at the end. There doesn't have to be a handshake. All of those things can be byproducts of a restorative process, and it can be really lovely when that happens. But that shouldn't be the goal. Ultimately, the goal should be taking accountability, repairing the harm. And then ultimately, of course, we're going to say that it should be trauma informed, that the process itself should be taking into account the trauma that any and all of the participants may be bringing with them. And the process should be set up in such a way that trauma responses aren't preventing people from meaningfully engaging in what's going on. So we want to make sure that facilitators are trained. Ideally, there should be two people involved, one who's maintaining the conversation and another who's sort of monitoring how people are doing and reading their body language so we can tell if someone might be experiencing some activation that needs to be addressed.
And so I think what's really critical is that if those sort of general principles that, might be somewhat hard to pin down, but these are really sort of generally agreed upon are the key principles to the RJ approach. If there are practices that you're learning about or know about or have observed that aren't adhering to any of those core principles there, like we have lots of questions about like the utility of them, right? Like is that really the right, and whether or not really it is in fact an RJ practice or approach. And I think that really leans into this next slide here around sort of what are the possible benefits for people who have been harmed, right? And, particularly for the VWAs who are involved in the Victim Assistance Academy, you work with all types of crime victims, right? Crime victims who have experienced interpersonal violence, crime victims who have experienced property crime, and I think that when I think about sort of the range of victimization that you all engage with in your work, I really think about how often some of the things up here on this slide are sort of woven throughout all of those different types of victimization experiences. So that sense of control or loss of control, whether if it's a vehicular accident that you're responding to, or if it is intimate partner violence, right? Peace of mind. What does peace of mind look like for victim survivors of all types of crime? And the RJ approach might be something that a person who is harmed could ostensibly be able to experience as a result. I think critically, we know that so many victim survivors, and you all see this all the time, victim survivors of crime, what does it mean to have accurate information and answers to questions about process or next steps, or what then? And I think so many of you, particularly the VWAs, are involved in trying to answer those questions all the time. And the RJ process can include, right, some question answering. Of course, there's that acknowledgement and validation, acknowledging sort of what has happened to them, and validating that what happened to them was real and concerning and a problem and harmed them. I think another piece that can be really another key benefit, possibly for people who have been harmed, is the participation piece, getting to actively participate in the RJ process. And so when we look at sort of some research that was done, we'll look at this later on, that's one of the key pieces actually, when we look at sort of certain types of crime victimization, is what does it mean for the people who've been harmed, the victims of crime, to actually participate in that process. The actual repairing of the harm might be a benefit, and we sort of say healing in quotes here because it's not the goal of RJ necessarily, but it could be a byproduct.
And I think a lot of people who participate in RJ, that's what they would describe, that's how they would describe their experience. And so it's really common, but again, we can't make it a goal because we can't force healing, right? Hopefully with that right engagement, that can be a byproduct, and it's beautiful when it happens. It's really important to understand that restorative justice is not any one process. But I think, as of the time we're recording this in Maine, restorative justice tends to be practiced using what's called victim offender dialogue. There can also be victim impact dialogue that happens at DOC. We'll have to talk more about that. But that's just one type of restorative process. In general, RJ dialogues or victim impact dialogues, it's set up in such a way that there's a facilitator or two, there are the people who have been harmed, and the person or people who have caused the harm, and the facilitator or facilitators are engaging them in a dialogue. It's just like how it sounds, right? So that's how we tend to see restorative justice practiced in Maine right now in 2023. But there are lots of other types of practices. So there's community accountability dialogue. This is where you might have community members involved, and you might have a community surrogate. So in lieu of a victim or survivor. So let's say victim or survivor, they support the process happening, but they don't want to be involved. They don't want to be there for any host of good reasons. This might now become a community accountability dialogue because a member of the community, maybe someone who's experienced the same type of harm or maybe not, they're going to sort of step in and speak more broadly about the type of harm that can be caused, or the type of impacts that can be caused by the harm in a given case. There's also this really great process called circles of support and accountability. And this is actually a process that happens post-conviction. And it's just working with people who've been convicted of crimes when they're released. And it's setting up, just as it sounds, it's members of the community who work with that person to help them stay accountable to the things that they need to be doing to make the transition out into the community. Checking in weekly or bi-weekly, and how are you doing getting a job, and your housing and your conditions and all of those things. Sort of like probation, but with a much more community focus, and it's not punitive when people aren't doing what they need to do. There's a different way of making sure that accountability happens. There's also this concept of a restorative panel. So you might have a group of community volunteers. This can happen either pre or post conviction in a criminal process. But there's a panel of volunteers. The person who's responsible for the harm talks about what they did and makes amends. The person who has been harmed talks about what their experience was. And the panel is involved in helping to determine what the sort of accountability outcomes should be. We'll talk more about that. But you can see this starts to look a little bit more like a tribunal, a little bit. There's also this concept of a healing circle. And you can have a victim healing circle that's just focused on victims, sort of like our COSA process. But this is just the person who's been harmed with community supports, and maybe there are other people who need to be involved in the process, could be an advocate, other support people, and they're involved in working with victims and survivors just on their healing. And then there's this concept of a peacemaking circle. Circles are really common in RJ. Sitting in circle is a term you'll hear a lot. RJ people, facilitators often want to host meetings by sitting in circle. And in its simplest form, circles are just a way for everyone to get a chance to contribute to the conversation or pass at the end of the day. And they're focused on questions and everybody answering questions from their perspective. So those are, again, broad brushstrokes, some of the basic processes and practices. And we offer this to say, RJ doesn't just have to be victim offender dialogue, as we might see. It's also different from mediation. So people are often familiar with mediation because it happens a lot in civil court. The difference is that mediation is assuming that both sides are morally equal. So this person is getting a divorce and this person is getting a divorce, and we're going to help resolve the conflict, and both sides will be heard. And arguably, both sides have contributed to the conflict in some way. RJ is different because it's assuming right off the bat that there's a power differential. Someone is responsible for causing harm. They've taken some sort of power from someone else in causing that harm. And there's an imbalance between the parties in that way. And the way to restore that imbalance is to address the harm. The harm needs to be addressed in order to restore power. So some of the concepts are similar in terms of, facilitators are going to use active listening and respectful language, and everyone's going to have a chance to speak. But the way the process will play out is going to look very different. It's not mediation. So again, some of the common processes that you're going to see in Maine, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here because I think that it's very important for advocates, community-based, system-based, to take the time to really get to know the people and programs that exist in your local community. Who's running the RJ program? Have them explain to you what services they offer, how their programs work. But generally, what we're going to see is a lot of restorative justice happening in the juvenile court context. And that makes sense because what we know about young people's brains is that they are very malleable up until the age of 25 and certainly even beyond. But when people have that capacity to change and to change their thinking, it makes them much better candidates for restorative justice, as you can imagine. A lot of juvenile cases too, that opportunity to heal relationships can be really important. We could be talking about parties who are in school together, parties who are in the same family. So RJ can be really beneficial in those cases for that reason. I think a lot of people have heard that there's a victim impact dialogue that's offered through the Department of Corrections. These are just for those convicted cases where someone is incarcerated for what they've done. And although I think they are working on possibly expanding it to non-incarcerated cases, for now, it's really primarily in the incarcerated setting. And this has to be victim initiated. It has to be the victim who says on their own, hey, this is something that I want to do. There's a victim offender dialogue program that happens in Cumberland County. It's sort of a pilot. It happens with very low level, I say low level crimes. I mean, crimes where there's often not a victim involved at all. Things like excessive speeding and driving without a license, that sort of thing. There's some RJ that's starting to happen in schools and in colleges and universities. And it's not happening in the criminal context. It's happening in the context of what would be what are called Title IX proceedings. So these administrative proceedings that decide whether or not a student should be punished for violating the anti-discrimination rights of students, other students. That's a long way of saying that, but think about campus sexual assault cases, for example, campus domestic violence cases. Those cases implicate gender-based violence and therefore gender discrimination, and Title IX comes into play there. And as part of that process, it's actually really, it can be a very innovative place to work on RJ. And there's a little bit of that work being done here. RJ is happening in other types of adult cases and in the criminal context all over the state. It's not very well mapped right now as of today. And so again, that's why it's really important to ask what's going on, learn about what's going on, and also to be part of advocating for what should be going on to make sure that victims can make voluntary and informed decisions about whether and how to participate. So next we're going to talk about preparing for an RJ process. What should go into the preparation? So ideally, before there's even an agreement that an RJ process is going to occur, the facilitator should meet with the defendant or the person who's responsible for the harm and make sure that they understand what this process is about. And most importantly, make sure that they're willing to take responsibility for it. RJ is not appropriate for a defendant who says, I didn't do this. That's what the criminal process is here for, is to give them an opportunity to have a jury decide whether they did it or not. So if someone says, I didn't do this, I don't want to take responsibility, then this is not a good case for RJ. So the facilitator should be meeting with them and making sure that that they really authentically are going to be able to meet that requirement. Also just addressing their general capacity to participate, when and how, and what access needs they might have. Other needs, hopes, they should explain the process really thoroughly, right? And then likewise, if we've gotten that far, then ideally the facilitator or another professional who's been designated to do this should meet with the victim or harmed person and go through that same process, assessing their capacity and their interests, their needs, hopes, and concerns. And we'll talk more about this, but really important here is that the victim survivor shouldn't feel pressured to agree that this is the best outcome and this is what should happen. And they shouldn't feel pressured to participate. And those are two different questions. Should this process happen? And do I want to participate? Again, the victim needs to understand what the process is. And then in the course of these conversations, the facilitator is also going to work to figure out, okay, who else needs to be involved? Boy, it really sounds like this victim survivor's mom was really traumatized and harmed by this experience. That person might need to be involved in this too. Or maybe there was a neighbor who saw what happened and it's been really scary for them to know that this happened. Really, the sky's the limit there. And likewise, it's possible that a harmed or a defendant's parents need to be there. Maybe they have a piece, especially if we're dealing with a juvenile case. So there can be that flexibility in terms of thinking about who needs to be involved, both from a perspective of who has something they need to share that's important when we're exploring what happened and why and all those other questions, but also sometimes we're thinking about who needs to be involved to address safety concerns and other needs.